By the mid-'80s, gamers had already destroyed the Death Star, sped across the frozen tundra of Hoth, dodged trees on a bike, and practiced with the Jedi's weapon. But these were merely slices of Star Wars, not the entire pie. What remained to be created was a game that could replicate one of the episodes from start to finish. The first attempt could not have been farther from the film. In 1987, Namco released a bizarre take on A New Hope. While it was a moderately complex platformer with simple controls, it felt like its designers had either never seen Episode 4 or didn't understand it. The player assumed the role of a black-haired Luke Skywalker who appeared blonde in the dialogue windows. After witnessing Leia's distressed cry, he left home to find the trapped princess, the droid with the message, and its mysterious Jedi owner. The game started out faithful enough. Luke crossed the desert and found the Jawa's sandcrawler. However, after jumping through its insides, it was revealed that the enemy holding R2-D2 captive was Darth Vader. As if that wasn't strange enough, delivering one hit of damage transformed him into a scorpion. Of the 6 bosses in the game, 2 of them were Vader, and the other 4 were monsters pretending to be Vader. The other 3 planets Luke visited were from the Star Wars universe, just not Episode 4. After a brief dogfight, Level 2 took Luke to Kessel, where Han allegedly made his 12-parsec run. But instead of exploring the spice mine C-3PO mentioned in the movie, Luke raided an Egyptian temple full of snakes and frogs. Level 3 took place on a water planet with a ruined building that looked a lot like the United States Capitol. Rescuing C-3PO finally brought the crew to the Death Star to free the princess, even if Vader fought Luke instead of Obi-Wan. Before arriving at Yavin and delivering the plans to the rebel forces, a quick trip to the ice planet Hoth revealed a frozen Chewbacca. When Luke eventually reached the Massassi Temple, it was overrun with stormtroopers holding Han Solo captive in a giant tree. This is curious because Luke had been piloting the smuggler's ship the entire game. For all its wackiness, including a surprise appearance by the bounty hunter Boba Fett, Namco's Star Wars featured 7 force powers available from the get-go. Speed, time freeze, saber blast, flight, warp, and others cost force diamonds that enemies dropped. You could also talk to characters in your party at specific moments, allowing R2-D2 to rescue you from the trash compactor, and Obi-Wan to give you some words of wisdom before you dueled with Darth Vader. While A New Hope on the Famicom could be enjoyed by fans with time to kill and a sense of humor, geeks who spoke English expected more. It was the first game ever to let you travel on the sands of Tatooine and run down the Death Star's corridors to cell number 2187. But the freaky definitely outweighed the familiar. 4 years later, JVC set the story a little straighter. Even after Empire and Return had been given their own names, A New Hope was still just called Star Wars when it was released in 1991 for the NES. Like the Namco version, it had platforming, Sandspeeder, Falcon, and X-Wing gameplay, but it also added 2 playable characters and a cohesive storyline. It traveled to the Game Boy in '92 and the Game Gear and Sega Master System in '93. After Uncle Owen bought the droids and Luke lost them, young Skywalker headed out on his X-34 and explored the local caves or Jawa transports for R2-D2 and the old hermit Ben Kenobi. On the southeastern tip of the desert map was the entrance to Mos Eisley, and the first door on the main drag opened up to the Cantina, its 5-man Bith band, some Rhodian scum, and the pilot of the Millennium Falcon. You had to talk to him directly as Chewie sat the NES out. Han joined your party, bringing his quick draw and rapid-fire blaster. Leia also teamed up after breaking out, supported by her agile high jump. If one of the supporting cast died, you restarted as Luke, but Obi-Wan could revive them a total of 5 times. The Game Gear port removed the overhead speeder map, but added 2 exclusive levels, Luke's on-foot journey to the Sandcrawler and Leia's search for R2 on the boarded Tantive 4. Despite its failure to mention Darth Vader, even in dialogue, JVC effectively chronicled Luke's adventure from the sandy dunes to the ceremonial throne room on the NES. Unlike the '87 game, which played the same musical theme for every level, the JVC Star Wars had a few new tracks from the movie, along with some funky originals. It had been 14 years since Episode 4 first charmed moviegoers, and video games were keeping the Force alive. Star Wars fans originally had to wait 3 years for the release of the second film, but both the NES and the Game Boy got it months later. Also published by JVC, The Empire Strikes Back took a few humorous liberties with the plot. The final lightsaber duel with Darth Vader journeyed through the carbon freezing chambers, but Han was never trapped in one of their metal prisons. Not only that, but Luke rescued him from Boba Fett by destroying Slave One in his X-Wing, effectively erasing the first half of Return of the Jedi. But branching out past the snow battle and asteroid chase made the NES Empire full of video game firsts, including the interior of the snowy Rebel base, the misty swamps of Dagobah, and the halls of Cloud City. R2-D2, Leia, Yoda, and Lando were the only Rebel allies to make personal appearances, but Han and Obi-Wan joined them in offering helpful advice. Luke was the lone playable hero, but JVC made up for it by including Force powers like Namco did in '87. By depleting your Force gauge, you could boost the power of your saber or blaster, levitate, jump higher, deflect enemy fire, and more. Unlike the abilities on the Famicom, Luke had to hunt these powers down in each level, although some appeared in multiple locations. A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back both graced the NES in its final hours, with the Super Nintendo coming to America the same year. Launch title F-Zero proved early on that vehicles could achieve a surprising amount of speed and maneuverability on the system, and JVC was quick to take advantage. In 1992, with Salt Lake City-based Sculptured Software, they forced 16 bits of Super Star Wars out of the SNES. Picking up after the title scroll, the game again started with Luke's innocent beginnings on Tatooine, and again embellished on the film's plot. Before even getting to Mos Eisley, Luke had already defeated the almighty Sarlacc, explored the exterior of the Jawa's sandcrawler, and killed a mutant womp rat. Once Luke made his way through Mos Eisley, the player could switch to Chewbacca. He met Han in the cantina, but not before defeating a full-size incarnation of everyone's favorite Djarik beast from the Falcon's holo game board. With the game's 3 main characters established, you could choose who was best fitted to attack each stage. Super Star Wars became famous outside of its namesake for having a high level of difficulty. Each gunslinger could fire in all directions, which is where danger was usually coming from. Luke was unfamiliar with the ways of the Force, but all 3 characters could upgrade their blasters from laser to flame, seeker, rapid ion, and finally plasma. The heroes proceeded to fight every manner of never-before-seen Imperial vehicles and finally witnessed the station's destruction by way of a Technicolor explosion. The console's Mode 7 scaling let you pilot Luke's land speeder on Tatooine while literally bullseyeing womp rats, and control Luke's X-Wing from the outside while it disabled gun towers and depleted the Empire's TIE Fighter fleet. The other boost in performance came from the added channels of sound, which gave Super Star Wars the chance to conduct 14 tracks from the John Williams score, more than any other game before it. These, combined with a library of authentic sound effects unheard since the arcade era, made moments like the dead end of the Death Star trench joyfully close to how it was first seen and heard. After the success of Super Star Wars, JVC placated the fanbase by releasing Super Empire Strikes Back only 1 year later. Advertised as a 12-megabyte game, Super Empire took the difficulty of its predecessor and magnified it to a notorious level. In order to make up for this, the sequel implemented a password system. But even on the easy setting, Empire was a beast. The playable characters were again Luke, Han, or Chewie, but you no longer had the ability to choose. Characters were playable based upon their scenes in the film. Luke trained on Dagobah, Han landed on Bespin, Chewbacca chased after Boba Fett, and so on. The rebel leaders could now double jump and sported new combat techniques. Han could now throw grenades, Chewbacca was outfitted with a powerful spin attack, and Luke could deflect lasers with his lightsaber and learn to use the Force. Once under the tutelage of Yoda, Luke had to find items representing the new abilities: mind control, elevation, slowdown, saber control, saber deflect, freeze, invisibility, and heal. Enemies would randomly drop Force orbs, keeping Luke's Force meter replenished. Notable differences between the game and its source material, minus the usual overkill, included Luke's ability to freeze enemies, Han's cathartic opportunity to fight the carbonite chamber itself, and Chewbacca's welcome slaughtering of Ugnaughts. The rest was glorious fan service, including more Mode 7 magic with a snowspeeder cable toss, the Falcon's ballsy asteroid chase, and Luke's approach into Cloud City aboard his X-Wing. And just like the movie, the game's cliffhanger ending would leave fans desperate for the final installment. Super Return of the Jedi followed the established release schedule and premiered in 1994. No game based upon the entirety of Episode 6 had ever been on a console or in an arcade. It also showed up on the Game Boy and Game Gear, making Jabba the Hutt portable for the first time as well. Touted as a 16-megabyte game, Jedi boosted its roster of characters to 5, including Princess Leia and Wicket the Ewok. Depending on the level, Leia was either disguised as the bounty hunter Boushh or strapped into the legendary metal bikini. Wicket appeared on the Endor levels and could fire arrows into tree trunks and then use them to ascend. The game definitely carried on what had by that point become standard for the Super Star Wars games. Characters who were minor in the film became fearsome bosses as players had to battle Jabba's gatekeeper droid, Bib Fortuna, and EV-99. The Rancor was also a boss, but you could use Han or Chewie to defeat it. The difficulty of Super Empire was tempered somewhat in Jedi, though the password system remained, as did the now requisite vehicular Mode 7 levels. The Falcon's dash through the Death Star proved to be not just a challenge for gamers' memorization skills, but also their eyes, as the screen was reduced to a fraction of its normal size, presumably to aid the Mode 7 scaling. Jedi also continued the tradition of introducing new, never-before-seen creatures, such as the Asumian Skiff Guard, who was actually based on a rejected design for the Rancor. The final confrontation with Emperor Palpatine also diverged from the film. What was originally little more than a conversation followed by swift lightning torture became a hard-fought battle over catwalks that would fall apart during the chaos. The Super Star Wars trilogy contains some of the most exalted games in the franchise, and it's the only series that's released separate games for each film. Wherever an action sequence could have been crammed into the narrative, JVC made it work. And whenever the plot needed to remain untouched, the SNES pulled through to the best of its ability. 13 years later, these three still bring back super memories, but they sure haven't gotten any easier. The year the Super Trilogy was finished, it had been nearly a decade since the Star Wars game had been released in the arcades. Still, offering technology that stood superior to home consoles, a new stand-up or sit-down X-Wing simulator was long overdue. To fill in the vector outlines of the original Star Wars arcade, Sega designed a Model 1 board with General Electric Aerospace, who made the first 3D simulators for NASA in the 1960s. The Model 1 was also used for Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter. What was technically Star Wars Arcade 2 should have really been called Return of the Jedi Arcade 2, because it portrayed the final hours of the Death Star 2. In the cockpit of an X-Wing or Y-Wing, the player braved an asteroid field, snuck into a Star Destroyer, scorched the surface of the space station, and finally dodged their way along the Death Star's interior. Because any Imperial assault is worth doing twice, Victory awarded another playthrough. A gunner could also enlist to control a second crosshair, making Sega's Star Wars the first cooperative shooter in the franchise. Genesis owners that were far from a local arcade and obsessive enough to stack 32X upgrades onto their systems got unlimited credits once they bought Star Wars Arcade the same year. The Genesis title lacked some of the Model 1's detail and cutscenes, but included a secondary 32X mode with more levels. Real 3D created the Model 3 board used for Desert Tank in 1994 and Behind Enemy Lines in '97. The company dissolved shortly after, but the hardware inspired Sega to develop another arcade shooter. This time, it would attempt to cover all 3 movies on one screen. The aptly named Star Wars Trilogy Arcade was released in 1998 and might still be running at a movie theater or funhouse near you. Trilogy Arcade allowed you to select which movie to take on at the beginning of your credit, letting you jump right into your favorite episode. A New Hope played out the Death Star skirmish, Empire Strikes Back followed the Hoth escape, and Return of the Jedi retold all sides of the Rebel victory at Endor. These events certainly were not unique to the franchise arcade pursuits, but players finally stepped out of the cockpit to help Princess Leia make her way to the Millennium Falcon inside the Rebel base and pick off scattered stormtroopers fleeing the Ewok-infested forest. In between each episode, 2 bonus levels from Return of the Jedi popped up that turned the pilot's joystick into a Jedi's lightsaber. One had you blocking fire from an airborne Boba Fett, and the other prompted you to perform defensive and offensive strikes to overcome Darth Vader in the Emperor's throne room. Both of these interludes are still the only time gamers have ever been able to handle a humming lightsaber with both hands to control the in-game action. The original trilogy got a rest until after the turn of the century, when 2 Game Boy Advance games were released as a setup to the prequels. One was an amusing side-scroller with realistic animation. The other was probably the worst-looking Star Wars game ever made. Flight of the Falcon was released in 2003 and was aimed at portable players with an affinity for Han Solo and his customized Corellian cruiser. Most of the heavily pixelated action took place in Han's ride, with the occasional race on a land speeder or bike. The 3D engine looked spectacular in screenshots and was barely comprehensible on a GBA. The only salvageable bonus from the game was an unlockable level where you steered the Falcon similar to classic space shooters like Gradius or R-Type. It's too bad the whole game wasn't like this. 2004 saw the release of Apprentice of the Force on September 21st, the same day as the digitally restored release of the classic trilogy. It borrowed its cover art from the 1997 Special Edition VHS box set. Celebrating the highest quality print of the first 3 films fans had ever seen, Apprentice followed Luke Skywalker through his pivotal choices on his way to bring balance to the galaxy. The animation style was the biggest difference compared to prior releases. Developer Ubisoft opted to use 3D images for the character models, similar to Mortal Kombat or Road Rash. Although it expanded on action sequences that never occurred in the movies, similar to the Super Nintendo series, most of its dialogue was transcribed line for line from the films, along with the pacing in which the events unfolded. By 2006, the films from the first Star Wars trilogy had been directly emulated in video game form around 30 times. It might have seemed excessive asking fans to take yet another trench run, but if there was one thing the games had never done, it was poke fun at the source material. After 3 decades, there was a lot of pent-up humor waiting to be released. A second legion of Lucas playthings came to life in 2006 as the original trilogy was released as a sequel to 2005's LEGO Star Wars. It arrived in stores on the same day as the deluxe DVD editions with the unaltered classic versions of episodes 4, 5, and 6. Over an hour of non-spoken cinemas told the LEGO story, and over 50 characters played their parts across 18 chapters. Following countless attempts at simulating the vehicle-based excursions, LEGO avoided a first-person perspective with precision aiming in favor of dragging around cabled mines and purple proton torpedoes. The shooting and platforming sections were as frantic as the other games had been before it, but Unlimited Lives took the edge off the difficulty considerably. By committing faithfully to the storyline, albeit a silly one, the LEGO Original Trilogy pioneered several virtual on-screen moments. Firsts included being able to guide Obi-Wan Kenobi through the Junlan wastes, narrowly escaping the asteroid worm in the Millennium Falcon, making Yoda hop through his swampy homeworld, helping Lando flee his prized floating facility, and controlling secondary characters like Greedo, Tarkin, Lobot, Bib Fortuna, Boba Fett, Admiral Akbar, IG-88, and the rest of the bounty hunters. The biggest departures from the canon were a standoff with the Imperial spy in Docking Bay 94, Luke and Leia's destruction of a landing pad on Endor, and father and son team Luke and Vader fighting the Emperor 2 against 1. Every other mission managed to build the major plot points without letting go of the collecting frenzied gameplay or youthful sense of self-parody. LEGO Star Wars is a great example of the challenge one faces when translating the trials of Luke Skywalker into an interactive adventure. You can either focus on restructuring the pictures shot for shot, or making a game that's really fun to play. The mediums have gone everywhere from Luke battling a pterodactyl to R2-D2 outsmarting a Rancor. If fans ask developers to be too married to the mythos, they might miss out on the more unusual and entertaining adaptations of some of their favorite films. In 2 weeks, we begin the saga anew, with the 18 Bombad games that brought the most recent episodes to life. We'll revisit the power battles, starfighter missions, clone campaigns, and dangerous bounties of the 3 Star Wars prequels, from the PlayStation 1 to the Xbox 360.